It's abundantly clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu is a political survivor, and I believe he's now the longest-serving Israeli leader. He's a war prime minister. Some believe, and I'll be interested to know, Shalom, what you make of this. Some believe he wants to continue the war on Gaza until he can gain enough political leverage to dismiss the corruption cases at home against him and build enough popular support to remain leader of Israel. Is there any merit in this?
I think the jury is still out there. He has potential courses of action in terms of how to pursue his political prospects right now. I think we could probably look at this and say that in terms of pursuing the war, it does have substantive objectives at the same time as maybe being self-serving ones. I mean, whether or not those are the ones that are determining how he acts is hard to say. The issue of whether or not what kind of support he'll engender from this is complicated. I mean, obviously, he's tried to offset the effects of the past 2 years of the war with what we've seen in Iran as well. He's sort of angling to say, that there have been these successes as well. He'd like to be able, together with President Trump, to put some crowning achievements on top of that as well. But I don't think we know. I mean, obviously, his personal trials, excuse the pun, are very much affecting his calculus as well, but those could go in multiple different directions. He's looking at polling as well, whether or not he's in a position now to go to an early election, whether he'd like to finish the term that he's already got another year plus still on the table. I don't think that there's a final decision on that right now, yes. but those are clearly all elements of the calculus.
Shalom, last May, you argued that Prime Minister Netanyahu might be on a collision course even with President Trump, and you noted an emerging gap between what President Trump says on Israel and what he's actually willing to do. Where do you think this relationship stands now, and how would you characterize the relationship between these two leaders? Because it seems like the U.S. administration is pursuing its own track while Israel pursues its own, and Mr. Witkoff has been deployed to the region, etc. Are they at cross purposes?
I don't think they're at cross purposes right now. The potential for that, obviously exists. As I said earlier, probably in that piece as well, but certainly as in our conversation this morning. I mean, there's obviously issues of pace, right? The president likes to do the deals, do them quickly. Maybe doesn't pay as much attention to detail as the prime minister does right now. So I think that, and after their sort of the success, I guess, called the operation in Iran, that both of them are taking credit for. We saw the victory lap yesterday, and the prime minister now has nominated the president for the Nobel Prize. I mean, I think their relationship seems to be in reasonably good stead. But that potential always exists, right? Because, I mean, there's always that possibility that you'll see a divergence. And, so one major question over the course of these 2 years, and, we're going to see how this probably unfolds, right, is that, that both leaders have talked about expanding the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia, to other countries. Yes. The Saudis have said, that'd be something we would be interested in, but, we expect some sort of movement in Gaza towards a peace, towards a Palestinian statehood, towards a resolution of that conflict. The Prime Minister is still saying that's not something that he's willing to countenance. If that, in fact, holds up that deal, would the President and the Prime Minister be at loggerheads? That's possible, but, it will play out over time. And there are a lot of moving pieces in a lot of different areas. Syria is on the table again. Yes. The United States withdrew sanctions, right? The president is very interested in bringing that conversation together. The prime minister is as well, but is, much more cautious about how long that could take. So, I mean, the potential for those stumbling blocks is always there. I don't think necessarily we see them today, but, they could always become, something that comes between the two of them at some point.
Shalom, final question is about the action against Iran. To what degree has that jeopardized stability in the prospect for a ceasefire in Gaza and an end to the conflict war? And furthermore, is Iran's conventional or nuclear capability really being neutralized, or does it still have the capacity to strike back?
I mean, obviously that capacity is reduced. I think that, there are headlines in the newspapers in Israel this morning from quoting the defense minister, the Israeli defense minister, who's suggesting that the missile threat maybe at this point is even greater than the nuclear threat. That's a question how that unfolds. Look, the interplay between all these theaters is interesting. One could make the case that it could go in either direction, right? On the one hand, Some have suggested that maybe Hamas would look at the situation in Iran now and say, it has no position, but has no alternative but to double down because, nobody really seems to have its back. On the other hand, it's also easy to see how they could look at that and say, well, maybe it's time to make a deal because nobody has our back. So we're going to have to watch how that plays out. I don't think we've heard the last word on Iran either, right? I mean, we've seen that the war after 12 days sort of shut down. But in another piece that I did yesterday, I talked about what kind of horizon there is for a negotiation. Can there actually be a deal there, a tight one with tight monitoring and compliance, and what that would look like? But if we saw, the president and the prime minister talk about this yesterday as well, right? The president is very excited about getting a deal, talking to the Iranians, doing that, engaging that process, and prime minister is talking about it as, a tumor that you have to keep your eye on, and that, that problem may not necessarily have gone away for, the amount of time that all the parties would hope. So, everything here is in flux. It continues to be very complex.
Shalom, and again, domestically, how much of a factor is this a very fractious coalition that Prime Minister Netanyahu has to corral, if you will? And there are parliamentary elections which I believe have to take place before October 2026. So how would you describe public opinion towards the Prime Minister in Israel? There's so much riding on the release of those final hostages.
Mm-hmm. No, so it's obviously it's a tenuous reality. I mean, as you indicate, I think that the public opinion is very much shifted now in terms of getting that war finished. At the same time, the Prime Minister does face opposition within his cabinet to doing that. The parties further to the right of his own are insisting that this war be pursued until all of its aims are achieved, and they're not looking to do deals. That certainly rides on him heavily. In a parallel universe, at the same time, the other flank in his government right now is engaged in that whole debate over draft exemptions for ultra-Orthodox youth. Right now, they're not voting with the coalition. Those members of the government are not currently voting on side with it. So there are a lot of fires there to put out, and which goes back to the earlier question about, on the one hand, maybe there's was a burst of popularity after the Iran strike, but there's still much trouble at home within his own coalition right now. It's not the most stable that it's ever been. I think that he's expecting that if he's able to continue down this road and keep the president on side with him, that maybe these things will recede into the backdrop, and the other parties won't have much choice but to sign on with him and continue that. But those tensions do persist, and they're not showing that they're going away anytime soon. I think right now his biggest hope is just to get to the summer recess and then kick that can down the road till after the summer.